So the Independent Electoral Commission filing that application at the Constitutional Court to seek the postponement of this year's local government elections. Now, while the IEC's court bid is still in the process, the Minister of Cooperative Governance has officially actually announced the 28th of October as the day we go to the polls. What is likely to be the outcome of the IEC's ConCourt application, and what are the implications for the postponement of an election, at least on the Constitution? To help us understand these, let's bring in PhD candidate and researcher at the University of Johannesburg, Ropafadzo Maphosa, who joins us now via our video link. Ropa, great to have you on the program. Thanks for agreeing to chat to us. So let me start here. How do you legally postpone an election without effectively changing the Constitution?
Morning, Ayanda, and thank you for having me, and good morning to viewers as well. Well, the process really currently without amending the Constitution requires going to the Constitutional Court and asking for a court order to postpone the election. And this is exactly what we see the Electoral Commission doing at present. They have already filed an application to postpone the election before the Constitutional Court, and we will be hearing from the Constitutional Court on whether or not it will be granting such an order to postpone the election.
But if that order is granted, it will be unconstitutional because it is in breach of a very clear mandate within the Constitution saying that there should be elections held in a certain period of time. Can the Constitutional Court be in breach of the Constitution?
That is certainly the situation that the Constitutional Court finds itself in, because it's supposed to be a guardian of the Constitution. And as many experts have said, this is an unprecedented case. So it is difficult to tell at this point whether the Constitutional Court will actually proceed to grant such an order. Of course, it can refuse to actually hear the case and say this is something that the Parliament is supposed to decide on. And obviously, the Parliament would have to amend the Constitution if such the case is taken to Parliament rather than the court. But if the court does decide to effectively grant the order, this means that Section 1592 of the Constitution, which requires the municipal election to be taking place in October, will be suspended in a way, and the constitutionality thereof is definitely questionable.
Yeah, in a way is the operative word, right? Because we're all not quite sure what to make of this moment. Let's say the order is not granted. How do we go ahead and have an election that we know the IEC is unlikely to declare as being free and fair?
Well, unfortunately, if the order is not granted, Ayanda, the IEC has no choice but to proceed with the election, because the IEC by itself does not have the power to defer the election without a court order. So the election would go on as planned. As we've seen, they have gazetted a day already, which is October 27th or 28th, and they will have to proceed with the election. Ultimately, we might see the election being challenged on the basis of its free or of whether it's free or fair. So the case will come back to the courts either way.
Yeah, sorry, that election date is the 27th. I think I may have said the 28th. That was my mistake. So let's continue unpacking the implications here on. Again, if the elections, for argument's sake, don't happen on the 27th, how worried should we be about the legitimacy of the authority of the local governments that are still in place? In other words, their mandate in some respects would have come to an end. Legally speaking, can they still make binding decisions, these local governments?
It seems from the court papers that have been filed by the Commission that the Commission is actually asking the court to declare that the municipalities that we have in place right now can act while we wait for the election to take place in February 2022. So basically, in other words, an order that municipal councils remain competent until new elected councils are declared. This effectively means that they are going to be in power longer than they're actually supposed to be in terms of the Constitution. But ultimately, if this is granted by the court, then they sort of have a legitimate basis to remain in power for the duration of the.
With that, looks like we've lost our connection to Ropa. It's a really interesting discussion, considering that it almost seems that the IEC and the courts are between a rock and a hard place. Ropa, it looks like our connection to you is back, but your point there had already been made. Let me ask this question then. How do you read into the position that the court has essentially been placed in here? Essentially, the court is, in some respects, asked to extend the mandate of individuals that people may feel need to be changed. When we speak of constitutionalism, does that speak to constitutionalism? The voice of the people essentially being left to 11 judges?
That is, of course, the situation of finding, because we have got the separation of powers, in our constitutional democracy or the constitutional framework that we have. So such a decision is supposed to be left in the hands of elected parties, and in this case, that means the parliament. So under ordinary circumstances, parliament would have to decide whether or not it's amending the constitution, whether or not it's necessary. But the problem now with the approaching the parliament is really twofold. Firstly, this is a time-sensitive case, as we see from the IEC making an agent application before the court, because ultimately a decision needs to be made before October the 27th. If the parliament was to amend the constitution to allow for the postponement to take place, that would take 12 to 16 weeks, and by then we might actually have crossed the October the 27th, and there would still be uncertainty regarding whether or not the election is supposed to go forward. So there are a number of, ultimately the court really is placed in a difficult situation, because I think the court itself knows in a way that it is now interfering into the sphere of the parliament, but at the same time, these are exceptional circumstances. So whether or not it's actually going to grant the court order remains to be seen.
The reality, of course, is that even if our vaccination drive continues as planned and enough people are vaccinated by February next year, there's still this thing of variants possibly emerging, which could, again, throw a spanner in the works. With that in mind, in other words, with the fact that we are not guaranteed a safer South Africa come February, how, I guess, should the Constitutional Court mull over the decision to be made here?
I think this depends really on the strength of the argument that is going to be brought by the Electoral Commission. So far, from what I've seen in the court papers that they have filed before the court, their argument is really that by 2022, in February, they expect that they would have reached herd immunity in South Africa, meaning that a significant portion of our population would be vaccinated by then. So it seems they are really relying on the success of the vaccination program to back up elections actually proceeding in 2022 rather.
Yeah. The elections are usually preceded by electioneering, and that itself could turn into a super spreader moment for this country. Even if the elections, let's say, are given the thumbs up for February, that means we're expecting electioneering to be taking place around December. That's also a time where we're expecting the fourth wave of COVID-19.
And I think those are the arguments that are going to be raised by those who are opposing the application, because if you see, for example, the DA in their statement, they've said they're going to be opposing this application, and they say one of the reasons is really because we need to adapt our electoral process to the pandemic, because the pandemic is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And they're making the same arguments that you're making, Ayanda, to say, so how do we know that by December or by February we'll be in a better position than we are now? And on the other hand, we have the IEC saying already if the election is to go on in October, it would not be free or fair, because, for example, independent candidates will not have sufficient platforms, effective platforms on which to campaign, because, as you know, with independent candidates, they need at least 50 signatures from their wards before they can actually enter an election. So how do they campaign, and are they able to match up to the campaign processes that are being launched by bigger political parties? Because bigger political parties such as the ANC, such as the DA, can easily campaign virtually, but for smaller parties and independent candidates, the playfield will no longer be leveled.
Yeah. So we can't necessarily have an election this year because the IEC is unlikely to consider it free and fair. We can't possibly have an election in February because, quite frankly, we may be in a worse position when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. The obvious question is, what do you do? But do we have examples in other countries about how they've dealt with this issue?
So far, many countries have been in the same predicament that we're in. I mean, we saw India going on with the election, but at the end of the day, their polling stations turned out to be, super spreaders. the United States of America proceeded with their presidential elections, and we all saw how that turned out. There were so many court challenges to the validity of those elections. So it's really difficult to look at a specific country as an example of what procedure to follow.
Tell you what, I'm really grateful I'm not a constitutional court judge or a member of the IEC. Thanks for your take on this, really appreciate it. PhD candidate, as well as a researcher at the University of Johannesburg, Ropafadzo Maphosa. Once again, appreciate your time on Newzroom Afrika.